Welcome to Speaking Concretely, the official podcast of the Cement Association of Canada. I'm your host, Adam Auer, President and CEO of the CAC. My guest today is Jennifer Keesmaat, one of Canada's most respected voices on cities, housing, and the future of the built environment. As Chief City Planner of Toronto from 2012 to 2017, Jennifer oversaw planning for one of the fastest growing urban regions in North America, navigating the real-world tensions between density, affordability, and livability. She is now a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Planners and a sought-after advisor and public intellectual on housing policy. She now also serves as president and CEO of Collecdev Markee, a Toronto-based real estate development and construction company with affordability at the core of their mandate, which means she brings to this conversation deep policy expertise grounded in the day-to-day realities of actually building homes. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Great to be here.
So I want to jump right into sort of the big picture on the housing situation in Canada. There are no shortage of hot takes on what the housing situation or housing crisis, in some people's perspective, we face this right now. You know, we have some arguing on one side that this is a generational crisis that demands urgent and large-scale government intervention. Others are pointing to softening prices and slowing construction starts as a sign the market may be correcting on its own. I mean, you've been a consistent and clear-eyed voice in the structural nature of this problem, I think, for many, many years. How do you frame what's actually happening, and are we getting the diagnosis right?
Well, that is not an easy question to begin with. It's kind of got everything wrapped into it. But I'll say right off the top is that one of the biggest challenges with what's happening in the housing market right now has been figuring out both the scale of the problem and the drivers behind the problem, which I would argue are also changing. They've been constantly changing over the past several years. But then also figuring out what kinds of interventions are going to have an impact. And so I think in terms of diagnosing what the challenge is, we went through this incredible period with a real boom in building for many years. And then you had a bunch of other pieces that layered into that, such as the post-pandemic surge in immigration, which basically meant for those of us in my world, because I started as an urban planner, who do a lot of work at looking at population forecasts and the implication of different kinds of high, medium, and low scenarios and how that will shape demand. It basically means that a lot of that work that was done over previous 10, 20 years was completely irrelevant. Like every single municipality in Canada pretty much saw their high scenario blown out of the water in the months that followed the pandemic. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we all thought for about half a year there was going to be a massive slowdown. So it's kind of been, shifting all over the place in terms of trying to understand what's happening in the market. But many of the people who are a part of the solution, regulators at the municipal level, people who play a role in the financial system around housing delivery, haven't really had any way of connecting with the driver for demand, which in part has been immigration. So the problem that we find ourselves in today is a situation where you have actually a surplus in some areas of homes, but people can't afford those homes, and a mismatch between the type of supply that we have and where we have that supply and the demand. So there's a bunch of, in some ways I'm saying nothing specific, which is there's a lot of different variables and a lot of different problems. And it's been really difficult to wrap our arms around what the solution is. And the federal government is starting to get involved really for the first time in a generation in trying to be a part of the solution.
So the government has obviously swung entirely in the opposite direction on immigration, which is one of the pieces of this puzzle. I want to talk a little bit about the affordability side too, because you recently posted on X, formerly known as Twitter, quoting economist Mike Moffat, that if we taxed a cup of Tim Hortons coffee the way we tax housing, you'd be paying about $66 for a single cup. Can you explain for our listeners what you mean by that? Like, what are development charges? What was their purpose? Why do they exist? And do they play a role in either enabling or blocking housing from getting built?
So this is a really important part of the story, and it's hard to understand the impact of these government charges. Development charges are they're really a tax on building new housing. That's the simplest way to put it. And it's in order to understand how the role of development charges have surged in the cost of housing, it's important to really look at two things. Really, the reticence of municipal governments to, I would argue, have a really good strategy around paying for infrastructure. That's the one part. And then the other part is, in some ways, it's been a bit of a dishonesty at the municipal level around what it actually costs to run a municipality. And so politicians over the course of the past 15 years realized, oh, they have this great little way out, which is they could put an extra little tax on the building of new homes. And what's great about that is no one lives in those homes yet. So they're not impacting the existing tax base. They're not impacting existing voters. But instead, they're kind of hiding that new tax for it. It's getting embedded into the cost of housing. Now, that was a model that worked until two things happened. That model stopped working when the charges got too high. So in the beginning, it was just kind of a modest fee. But when it worked so well, municipalities started significantly increasing the development charges that they added on to new housing, and then it started to become really noticeable. But another problem occurred, which made development charges a model that was no longer sustainable, and that's the change in interest rates. Because developers pay the development charge when they pull the building permit, which basically means that development charge on a new unit is paid right at the beginning of the construction process. So it means it's a cost that you carry through the entire construction period. If you're borrowing to pay that cost and interest rates are high, it's very expensive. If interest rates are low, you don't really care that much because interest rates are low. So as soon as municipalities started significantly increasing the amount that you had to pay. So on a 2-bedroom unit in Toronto right now, it's approximately $72,000. That is just pure tax that's going to the municipality to pay for infrastructure. Once that cost became really high and it was combined with higher interest rates, it started to kill a project pro forma. And so those two things happening side by side is what really created this gridlock in the building of new homes across the entire country. And it's fair to say that it's kind of outrageous that when you have an affordability crisis, that the government itself is lobbing on the cost of a whole bunch of other things to building a new home. So, for example, when I build a new home in the city of Toronto and I pay a development charge, that development charge is paying for a whole variety of different things in the municipality. It is paying for a new subway in the suburbs. It is paying for seniors housing. It is paying, a little charge goes to daycares. There's a little part of the fee that goes to a library fee. And remember, these aren't user pay because that's what your taxes are for. This is an extra amount of money that's getting lobbed onto the cost of a home. It's like a special tax for the building of this new home that goes to a whole variety of different services that exist within the municipality. And look, I think it was a great run. I think municipalities got away with it and were able to fund a lot of interesting things through it. And it's a model that is completely broken and development charges need to go away. It's a terrible way to fund infrastructure in 2026. And it's a model that I don't really think is ever going to work again. So we have to think about paying an infrastructure in a fundamentally different way. Get rid of the development charge model.
So there's two problems there that need to be solved, it sounds like. On the one hand, I think, we've heard from the federal government anyway, and some provincial governments that funding is on its way to help cut development charges. So Ontario, the federal government have jointly announced that they're going to spend $8.8 billion to cut development charges in half. And they're also working together to remove HST on new homes. So that might create a separate problem on how do we fund infrastructure. But does it actually move the needle on affordability and construction timelines in the housing space?
It does move the needle. It's important. It's critical what the the federal government has done with Ontario. It goes part of the way, but not all of the way. One of the challenges that the federal government has had is that they made a promise, Prime Minister Carney did during the election campaign, that they would get rid of development charges. In fact, it was actually in the speech from the throne as read by King Charles, which I was like, wow, I never thought I would hear King Charles talking about development charges in Canada. But there you have it. It actually happened. But that actually did kind of a weird thing, because real estate, more so than many other industries, is all about signals. There's signals as to where things are going. And anyone who's building housing is taking a pretty big risk, because there's a whole variety of things that are going to impact the viability of a project that you don't really know yet. Is the cost of the windows, is it going to go up or going to go down by the time you have to tender those windows? You don't know that at the time that you get your approval and you decide to proceed with your project. So there's all these variables that you have to play around. So signals really matter. And a big part of being a developer is reading the tea leaves and trying to figure out the signals. And as an aside, a lot of the folks who are in a lot of trouble right now in the industry read the signals wrong, right? They were like, oh, land values are going to go up indefinitely. Well, guess what? Land values have crashed. So if you paid too much for your land, your pro forma no longer works, and a bank won't finance it. So the signals really, really matter a lot. So when the king read from the speech from the throne that development charges were going to be eliminated across Canada, if you think about it for a minute, what developer is going to rush to City Hall and pay their development charges?
Everyone's pens down.
Everyone's pens down. Why would you do that? And we even had that with some of our projects where we were like, okay, well, do we delay our projects until this policy now gets implemented? And so we sort of changed our timeline and our approach on some of our files as we're waiting for the promise we just heard from the lips of the king. We're waiting for that to be implemented. And so, 8 months later, the federal government cuts a deal with Ontario that goes halfway, right? It's 50%, not 100% of development charges. So, the signals matter. The government, I would argue, has been doing some of the right things, but the way it's been rolled out has actually messed with the momentum in the market over the short term, and that is really challenging. There's another nuance to this, which is that every municipality sets their own development charges, and some municipalities like Mississauga and Vaughan a couple of years ago had already taken the bold step of significantly reducing their development charges, and in Mississauga's case, specifically on 3-bedroom units, because they wanted to incentivize getting 3-bedroom units built in the city. The city of Toronto, it was probably about 4 years ago, put in an escalating, it was actually done under Mayor John Tory, an escalating increase to development charges. That the escalation is, there's two problems with it. It's outrageous, the amount that they're increasing these development charges, but also they started escalating because it was approved 4 years ago at exactly the time when the market could not bear this additional cost, at exactly the time that the interest rates, as I mentioned earlier, that sensitivity, if interest rates go up, it's an enormous additional cost to your project because you have to borrow that money over the life of construction. So in a city like Toronto, when the government says we'll cover 50% of development charges, you end up with this wonky dynamic where municipalities are actually incentivized to increase their development charges because the federal government's going to step in and cover 50% of them, which gets you off the hook for trying to figure out how to pay for your infrastructure. All of this to say, the interplay between the various levels of government and these policy mechanisms as it relates to housing, they're like not straightforward at all. They're quite complicated. And I think one of the things the government at the federal level struggled with when they wanted to make good on their promise around development charges was they suddenly realized that they had this problem that if a municipality had outrageously high development charges and they came in and said, hey, we're going to cover your development charges, they're sort of rewarding the municipalities who've abused the development charge system because it was just kind of a blanket approach. So Where does that leave us right now? Well, in Ontario, for some projects, and this gets at the heart of your question, for some projects, the 50% forgiveness of development charges absolutely will be the tipping point from a non-viable project to a viable project. But it's not going to be the case on all projects, but it will be on some projects. And I think that's what we find with a lot of the policy changes that are being recommended right now, the HST removal as well. It has an impact on some projects, but not all projects. And it depends on a whole variety of other variables related to those projects, including the cost of the land. Like anyone who bought land in the peak, even with no development charges, are probably not making those projects work.
Sounds like some complicated municipal politics, and at any rate to work out in terms of not punishing those who were a little bit of ahead of the curve on the development charge conversation in any case.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I guess, what I'm hearing is that this Ontario partnership is a bit of an experiment. Do you see this as kind of a staging ground for how other provinces might try and join in on these types of approaches?
Well, the federal government right now is really shifting back to trying to work through the provinces. And again, it might be, but I suspect there's going to be a very different deal with each province, depending on how each province already utilizes and approaches development charges, because development charges are set in provincial policy. So each province has a planning act, and that is provincial jurisdiction, and the planning act around development charges and enabling development charges is different on a province by province scale. So I think it's an important clue that we should expect that they would like to do something like this from province to province, but I'm not entirely sure if that's how they are going to approach it. We do know that they want to work more with the provinces, because you'll remember under Minister Sean Fraser, when the Housing Accelerator Fund was announced, that Minister Fraser worked directly with municipalities. He skipped over the provinces. He said, look, any municipality who's willing to change their zoning and upzone, and I was an advocate for this policy approach, any one of those municipalities, we'll do a direct deal. And you were in this, really for the first time in history, this moment where you had the Minister of Housing meeting with mayors and cutting deals with mayors and saying, you do this.
The most senior government jurisdiction negotiating with the most junior.
Exactly. And so it feels like, I think what we're seeing right now is Prime Minister Carney is trying to go back to creating provincial-wide policies and provincial-wide approaches where the federal government works directly with municipality, and then it's between the municipality and the province to sort out how that's getting implemented. And that's the situation we're in Ontario right now, by the way. So it was announced at the federal level and the provincial level. But if you ask anyone at City Hall right now what the implications of this policy are for the City of Toronto, they don't yet know. Because now there's another layer of policy, which is an arrangement between the cities and the province that needs to be structured in order for the DC forgiveness to be executed. So that hasn't happened yet. So there's still some uncertainty as to how this is going to play out on the ground. Now, I'll give you an example of what that could mean. Does any project get the 50% forgiveness, or do you have to meet certain criteria? Does it need to be a transit-oriented development? Does it need to have a certain percentage of affordable housing? Does it have to meet green standards? No one really knows the answers to those questions, because all of that level of detail has not yet been worked out.
I think we could have a whole other podcast talking about the political dynamics at play in terms of what Carney's trying to do to repair some relationships that may have deteriorated a bit over the past 10 years. But one of the things you just mentioned was zoning rules. And, so I want to maybe shift from cost to this kind of regulatory policy environment. And, many cities certainly have updated their zoning rules to try and be more permissive of density and, different types of housing types. And, and for me, I see it a bit analogous to, in my industry, we have specifications that on the one hand might be telling you, we want to, durable materials that adapt to climate change, or we want to reduce the carbon of the materials that we're using in our infrastructure. But then you have these specifications that basically create these prescriptive rules that make it impossible to meet those objectives. And I sort of see zoning rules kind of in the same ilk, that you have, these, I think consensus policy objectives around building housing faster and more affordably, but rules that kind of get in the way of those objectives. Do you think that we're making meaningful progress on the zoning side that actually will, make a meaningful impact in terms of supply and affordability and overall livability of our neighborhoods?
Are we going through a fundamental shift in how we regulate zoning at the municipal level? The answer is yes. And we're in a moment of seeing zoning reforms in municipalities across North America. This is a movement that actually started in Minneapolis, believe it or not. And then it got picked up a bit in California, and then it started to spread right across Canada. But we're in a moment where we're shedding a framework that was incredibly restrictive and insisted on a real juxtaposition with respect to housing of very, very low density places and much higher density places, usually aligned with transit corridors. So, I like to refer to it as tall and sprawl has really been the North American model for development. And we're moving into a moment where zoning is changing in such a way that we're starting to see much more incremental housing forms and types, some of which were really prominent in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And you see a lot of this in older suburbs where you have 3- and 4-story walk-ups that at that time were permitted, and then really over the past 30 years have not been permitted at all. And now we're starting to see really zoning get shaken loose in some ways. And many municipalities, and this is tied to the Housing Accelerator Fund, and I just want to say that that model that was advanced by the federal government really was very powerful, because essentially municipalities were told, look, if you liberalize your zoning, you will in fact get funding to deliver new housing types and forms. And many municipalities across the country at the council level saw the writing on the wall and did the unthinkable thing and started allowing incremental density into what had previously been thought of as stable residential neighborhoods. So you started seeing, and we're starting to see it now in neighborhoods in Toronto, where you're seeing 4-plexes and 6-plexes, which might be still in a 2-story built form, but now we're also seeing 4-story and 6-story built forms as well. Your question, Adam, specifically was around, will we see more housing get built, and will that housing be more affordable? That's where the question gets trickier, what the implication will be. I think if this zoning reforms had happened 10 years ago, I would have without hesitation said yes. But the zoning reforms are happening at a time when interest rates are a problem, when development charges still are a problem across the country. Even if they're starting to get addressed in some places, they still are a problem. So making these projects work from a pro forma perspective is still very, very challenging. So long and the short is, yes, zoning is being reformed and it's changing. What will the material impact of that be on driving affordability? I think there's a bunch of other layers that are needed before we'll get to a more affordable housing. We'll get a more diversity in our housing types, meaning we'll get more, on my walk to work every day, I go by what looks like a single family home that has just been rebuilt as a 4-plex. So from the outside, it still looks like a single family home, but it's actually been divided up into 4 units. That's a good thing. That means in that neighborhood where previously there were only single family homes, there's now a diversity of price points and unit types and home types. But are they affordable? Well, in the neighborhood I walk through, there's no way they're affordable.
So we've talked about the cost side, development charges, HST. We've got moderated moderating interest rates for now, depending on what happens with inflation and various conflicts around the world, which we don't need to get into in any detail. We've talked a little bit about changes to the zoning rules. And so what do you like from you've got this unique perspective because you work both on the inside as a planner, and now you're trying to actually work on the outside of the market, getting stuff built. What are we missing? What is government missing, if anything, that, from this kind of mixed bag of approaches that's being taken? Are there pieces that you would say they need to prioritize, or are there pieces that are missing altogether that should be put on the table?
Well, I don't know if you hear this all the time or not, but from where I sit in actually getting shovels in the ground, everything is too slow. It takes us too long.
I have heard that once or twice.
Have you heard it? Has anyone mentioned that we have a problem with bureaucracy?
I may have said it a few times myself.
So we have a really, really big challenge. And the longer something takes, the more it costs, even with a planning approval. If you can get your approval done in 3 months, or you typically as a developer, if you can get your approval done in 3 months or it gets done in 3 years, you actually had one line item in the budget for that approval that's the same. So you can imagine when it gets stretched over 3 years, the impact that has on a company. It just introduces so much risk. So I would say there's really the issue of that everything just takes too long. Like even getting our environmental approvals at the province, which people never really talk about around our soil conditions. This is something that should be, there should be a program in AI where we send in our soils report and the program can pump out our approval when we meet all the criteria. But instead, we have to wait months and months in order to get a response. And that adds really big risks and delays. With municipal approvals, we have a project north of the city that it's a multi-building site. So 12 buildings in a complete community. We're building a cafe and a community center and an affordable daycare, a whole variety of different things that we're building on that site. And it's all the good things. It's got a new public park. It's being built out of cross-laminated timber. And it has taken us, and I'm embarrassed to say this, by the way. I'll say it, but I'm really embarrassed to say this because I should be like the superstar of getting this done. But it has taken us 5 years to get our approvals finalized. And a lot of the things that have taken so long really aren't that hard. It's just been a matter of staff turning over. It's been a matter of reports getting stuck on desks. If you look at the work that's been done over that 5-year period, some of it has been some real heavy lifting, but there's a lot of stuff that just really could have been done much more quickly than it has been done. So we've got to unlock this problem. It's like systems problems that we have with any large infrastructure project as well as with housing in this country.
Is anybody getting it right? Like, do you look at other jurisdictions outside of Canada and say, like, why aren't we doing that here?
Well, the thing that's weird is that if you look at Western Europe or a place like London, England, they take even longer than we do to get things built, and they have even more restrictions on how they build and develop. And then you can look in places like Australia, where they tend to be quicker, and Australia is an interesting comparison because they have the same land use planning framework that we do, being a part of the Commonwealth. But it's really hard to cut and paste from one other jurisdiction. There's so many things that are nuanced here. Like our financing system for housing is like no other in the world. It's very different than how they do it in America. So I think that really the fix here, there's a regulatory fix that's required. There's a financing fix that's required. And then there's like an execution fix that's required in order to deliver things more quickly. But it's something that permeates all systems. Same for transit. So it's not a housing problem. It's a large infrastructure problem in this country, which I think means we've a regulatory framework problem.
I want to talk a little bit about the kind of logistics side of this whole equation. And you mentioned cross-laminated timber, and I forgive you for that. But you've also spoken in the past about modular housing, and this is another part of the suite measures that government seems to be focused on, in particular to fix this perceived problem of speed of construction. And we're fans of modular. Concrete industry has been delivering modular solutions for decades. Tons. So obviously, precast is a huge part of the built environment in many different applications. But for listeners who might not be as familiar, what is the case for modular? I mean, is there a real problem on the speed side, given all the other sort of structural challenges that we face? Is speed of construction part of the problem that we need to solve, and is modular the way to solve that problem?
Okay, well, two answers to this. And first, I'm just going to qualify my timber comments by letting you know that in 4 weeks, we're topping off a 34-story concrete tower. And I'm about to go to tender for $43 million worth of concrete.
It's a fun little jab.
It is.
Building materials all work very well together. Even mass timber buildings have lots of concrete, and we're all just trying to build the highest quality structures. So I was just having a bit of fun.
Yeah, for sure. And you're absolutely right. I think it's often missed that precast is a really critical part of modular solutions. And your question's an important one, because I think the language and the discourse around modular construction has implied that speed of construction is the number one problem in our housing industry. And I would argue that that's not at all. You just heard me tell you it took 5 years to get approval on this new development in the north of the city. That's before construction. That has nothing to do with construction. But I would argue that there are ways that we need to modernize all aspects of the housing delivery system. And the way we construct is linked to our approvals processes. And so in some ways, I think we need to pull the lens out a little bit higher, and we need to look at the way we're constructing, and we have to look at our approvals process. We have to bring those two things much closer together, rather than seeing them as something that happens consecutively, seeing them as something that happens concurrently. And speed of construction, I don't think, is the root of the problem, but I do think that there's more efficient ways that we can construct. Look, precast panels is a perfect example of that. They're a very efficient way to deliver component parts on a building. So I think there's just all kinds of different solutions for the delivery of various elements of any building that we should always be looking at improving. But is the speed of construction the number one problem that we face? I don't actually think it is at all. It still needs improvement, and we should still always be pursuing best practices. But I think the financing and regulatory frameworks are bigger problems right now.
So what is the role of the construction and development industry then? We talked about the government piece and the different moving parts that they can manipulate towards better outcomes. But what should folks that are actually working in the supply chain be thinking about how they might need to change in order to support this transition? Is there something that, cement and concrete producers or construction companies or developers need to do differently in order to contribute to, the ultimate objective of building more, faster, and more affordable?
Well, I think there's, if we see that the biggest challenge is regulatory and financing, it means that the biggest problem doesn't rest with how we are constructing. That said, and honestly, I've been very impressed with the interest in the construction industry in embracing a whole variety of different modular technologies and new ways of delivering. We often say that not a lot has changed in construction over the past 100 years. But I don't actually know that that's really true. Like, if you can see some of the buildings right outside my window, right outside my window is a 40-story rental building. That's a really big change. And that's actually a very efficient built form. You can put up a floor a week on a building like that. So I think the emphasis really is in those other two areas. It's on the regulatory side and it is on the financing side. I think that the industry needs to continue pursuing best practices, and particularly around sustainability, sustainable products, sustainable systems, looking at waste reduction, which is something that has been a real emphasis of modular technologies as well. So I think that there's a whole variety of very specific things that can be looked at, looking at materials and the types of materials that are used, the way materials can focus on things that are renewable. I think those are the big areas where the construction industry needs to focus.
Well, I'm glad you brought up sustainability because it is probably the most frequent topic of conversation on the podcast. And it's been, an important focus, certainly the cement and concrete sector. I'm wondering, you talk about how a lot of people don't see a lot of innovation in the construction sector, despite the fact that, I would argue like you that there's been a ton of innovation, in particular on the sustainability side, but also on performance and efficiency and, productivity at the manufacturing facilities. Do you see, and it's a bit of a loaded question because I have my own views on this. Do you see that the framing of the housing crisis, do you see it as complementary or as an obstacle to achieving those other objectives like sustainability? Do you think we're going to, all the progress that's been made in trying to integrate green building standards and, lower carbon materials and more efficient designs, is that all falling by the wayside in the name of building more, faster, and cheaper?
Well, I think it could. It doesn't need to. The provincial government in Ontario has made it very clear that they see any kind of green standards as being frivolous and problematic. The building industry, when Toronto's green standard was first brought into force, the building industry went absolutely crazy and said that these standards were going to completely kill any new development in the city. And I think that was in 2005. So look where we are, 2007. So look what we did after those building standards came into play. And many people in the industry, when I was chief planner, would pull me aside and say, hey, just so that you know, I know that publicly I have to really, speak out against these standards, but just so that you know, I build better buildings in Toronto than I build in Vaughan because you make me. So there was also a point of pride around the sustainability that was being integrated into the buildings. And then there was a market interest in those sustainability features. Developers advertising that their building was LEED green because buyers were looking for buildings that were more efficient with better air quality, that had better HVAC systems and all those other good things. So I think the whether or not building greener and more sustainable buildings is seen as being a drag on the housing economy in this moment in time. That's really about how the narrative gets framed, really. And you can frame it in a lot of different ways, but there is absolutely a group in our provincial government in Ontario is doing so that wants to frame it as being a problem, but I don't think that's materially true. And we also know that once we start embracing a lot of modular technologies, that has a really big impact on being able to deliver more sustainable housing supply if we're building in sustainability considerations very early into the development process.
Yeah, for the record, I would agree wholeheartedly that you can have your cake and eat it too. In this instance, there is so much low-hanging fruit in the sustainability conversation that, while we would support a standardization of approaches to sustainability in building standards, we think that, absolutely they should be included as part of the criteria, in addition to tackling the affordability and supply side. What better opportunity than during, a push to build more housing and infrastructure is there to modernize the approaches to building that housing and that infrastructure to make it more durable, more sustainable, and to push the manufacturers to kind of invest in those other metrics.
Well, and to take it one step farther, Adam, there's also a risk of the inverse, which is that we go through a huge period of building and we miss the opportunity to make the housing supply that we're building more sustainable, that we actually miss the window for doing that. So I think the inverse is also true.
Yeah, once things are built, they're around for some time. So you don't have another kick at the can for another 60 to 100 years or more.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, this has been a super fun conversation, super informative for me as well, and for our listeners, I'm sure. I like to sort of end the podcast with kind of, crystal balling a little bit. You've, as been mentioned a few times, has spent your career working on a problem, this, housing and affordability problem, and sort of the related kind of urban planning ecosystem that in some ways anyway seems to have gotten worse. So, what's keeping you at the table, and is there a version in your mind of this story where Canada genuinely solves its housing crisis and comes out the other side, being able to pat itself on the back for addressing what is obviously a super important issue for the country?
Well, it's funny because in some ways I actually haven't been on this problem for very long, because I started out as an urban planner in private practice. Then I went into the public sector where I worked as the chief planner, and I have the wonderful accolade of having approved more housing than any other person in North America, both by virtue of the systems that we had when I was at the city, but also the moment in time. It was just kind of a lucky moment in many ways to be there and to have this passion about driving forward change at that time. But one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing now was because towards the end of my tenure as chief planner, I became increasingly perplexed and worried about the viability of our city as a truly vibrant urban place if families and young people and newcomers could no longer come to this city and get a foothold and make a life for themselves. And I started to see housing and access to affordable housing as being really the crux of that issue. I had a conversation with Mayor Tory in my last year, which really sowed the seeds for what I'm doing right now, where we had put a bunch of incentives in place at the City of Toronto to get more affordable housing built, and no one was taking us up on the incentives. Everyone was going crazy building luxury housing, luxury rental, high-end condos, but no one was taking us up on building affordable housing. And Mayor Tory said to me, Jennifer, we're putting these incentives in place. Why isn't it working? What's the problem here? We're trying to get this done. We're making it really appealing, but no one's doing it. And I thought about what he asked, and I looked at Mayor Tory and I said, well, I just don't think there's anyone out there with the mandate to do what we're asking them to do. There's no private sector developer that has a mandate to actually focus on the question of high quality, affordable housing. And that was the moment where this thing that often happens to me in life, which is, oh, maybe I have to be the one to do this. And that thought never left me. So I really actually haven't been at this in the housing space for that long. I've been doing this for about 7 years, and we've completed thousands of units as a company. We have just under 1,000 units under construction right now, and in the next 12 months, we will be bringing another 1,000 units to the market, and we're doing that in a very, very unique model. And in part because 7 years ago, in looking at, my passion about affordable housing is very much driven by my passion for what makes a city work. I come at it truly as an urbanist. What makes a city a great livable place? Well, when your healthcare workers have to live 2 hours outside of the city because they can't access housing in close proximity to the hospital where they work, that doesn't make for a vibrant city. when families cannot be raised in the city, but instead families must be raised in suburban environments where they must be driven everywhere, that doesn't make for a vibrant city. So it was my passion and my question about, we're going down a path here that's going to drain the lifeblood out of the city. And, I haven't even started to talk about things like, newcomers and young people and artists. All of these different constituencies are what make cities vibrant, interesting, exciting places of ideas and interaction and inclusion. Really, the linchpin behind all of that is access to housing that you can afford at various stages of your life. So that was the driver at the end of my tenure as chief planner that made me really concerned about the future of the city. And I'd spent a lot of my time, transit planning. I drove forward the transit network plan that's resulting in the building of the Ontario line today. I did a lot of in transit planning. I did heritage preservation. I did all these other things, but it was at the end of that tenure that I was deeply troubled by this question of us as a city being a place where all of the types of people who make cities work and interesting and great for new immigrants to integrate into Canadian society. And all of those things, it seemed to me, kept coming back to access to housing that people could afford. And so that was the reason why I ended up in this space, and why I'm now a housing developer, and why I now run a development company, and why I own a construction company, is because I basically went, okay, right, I'm going to figure out how to do this thing, because this thing must be done, and it must be done for the future of our cities. So what makes me hopeful? Well, I will say I honestly had no idea how hard this was going to be, and it is way harder than I thought it was going to be. And we are now in a 40-year downturn in our industry that really arrived halfway through this experience of being in this space. I think the thing that makes me hopeful, which is a bit of a weird one, because I'm not going to say it's all the inspiring politicians or all the inspiring people. It's not going to be that. Although I will say that Prime Minister Carney has made this one of his top 6 priorities, and has backed that up with putting in place very quickly some key initiatives in infrastructure and funding, like Build Canada Homes. That makes me hopeful. So that is one thing that makes me very hopeful. But the other thing that makes me hopeful is that I honestly think that too many people care too much about our cities and our country to let us fail. There are too many people who care too much. So, and we've seen that over the past 18 months, how much people care about this country and about our cities. And if we care that much, we'll bring our best efforts to figuring out how to solve this problem. And I want more people who care passionately about our cities and our country to say, right, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to get engaged, and I'm going to figure out how to be a part of the solution. And I've been seeing like some new organizations popping up focusing on this. And when I see that, I see some that look a little bit like what we're doing. And I'm like, that's very cool. That's what we need. More people coming to the table to saying, right, this matters, and I'm going to put my shoulder to the wheel and make sure that I'm a part of delivering the change that we need to see.
That is a beautiful way to end, because it takes what I think many people perceive as kind of a technocratic challenge and really humanizes it. Jennifer Keesmaat, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure, Adam.
Thank you to our audience for listening. And don't forget to subscribe and follow our podcast on your favorite platform. We hope to see you next time.